He was the last one left on the block, the last child nobody wanted. He stood there barefoot and silent, clutching a newborn baby in his arms. The sun beat down on the dusty town square, baking the sweat to his skin, but the boy didn't seem to notice. He just stood on that creaking auction platform, his eyes too hollow for a boy his age. 8, maybe 9 years old, but he carried the weight of a man who'd seen too much. The crowd had thinned. They'd bought the other orphans, the ones who came with strong backs and no baggage. They were sold off like cattle, their names barked out before coins clinked, and they were led away by new masters. Sympathy for the first few, greed for the middle ones. But this boy was different. He came with a burden. A man in a fancy bowler hat shouted from the side, his voice dripping with impatience. "Let's move on, Sheriff! Ain't nobody buying 2 mouths for the price of 1. A grumble of agreement went through what was left of the crowd. The heat was making everyone mean. The baby in the boy's arms didn't make a sound. It didn't stir. It was wrapped in a bundle of old cloth, held so tightly against the boy's chest you could barely see it. That eerie stillness was what made folks uneasy. A baby that didn't cry wasn't natural. The auctioneer, a man with a face like worn leather, cleared his throat. "This one here. His name's Caleb, 9 years old. Comes with his little brother Matthew, born just a few weeks ago." He paused, hoping for a bid. Nothing. "He's a strong boy, knows how to work, can milk a cow, chop kindling, carry water." "He's got a baby!" A woman snapped from the crowd, her face twisted in a sneer. "He ain't worth a plug nickel with a squalor hanging off him." Caleb flinched at her words, the first sign of life he'd shown. He pulled the bundle even tighter against his chest and rocked side to side, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement. Just then the baby stirred. A flicker of movement under the cloth, and then it was still again, but someone was watching. At the very edge of the crowd, a man stood as still as a statue carved from rock. He wore a long, dust-covered duster and leaned on a heavy walking stick. He hadn't moved or spoken the entire time, his face hidden in the shadow of his hat. His name was Abram Cutter. 5 years ago, he'd buried his wife, Abigail, on a hill overlooking a ranch that hadn't heard the sound of laughter since. The doctor had told him long ago he'd never be a father, and after Abigail died, he'd stopped wanting to be one. He'd buried himself in work, mending fences, tending cattle, and keeping the world at a distance. But there was something about the boy on that platform. The way he didn't cry, the way he didn't beg, the way he stood there, a lone warrior protecting his charge against the whole world. It stirred something in Abram, a feeling he thought had been buried with his wife. He took a step forward, then another. The small crowd parted for him without even realizing it. Abram's voice was rough, like stones grinding together. "I'll take him." The auctioneer blinked, stunned. "Him? You mean both of them?" Abram gave a single sharp nod. "Both." A price was mumbled. $5. A pittance, an insult. It was the price of getting rid of a problem. "I got land," Abram said, his voice cutting through the whispers. "I got food. I got work that needs doing." "That enough?" The sheriff started to step forward, but the auctioneer, seeing something in Abram's eyes, just slammed the hammer down. "Sold. To Abram Cutter." Caleb didn't move. He just stared out at Abram, his hollow eyes searching for something. A trick, a trap. "Come on, son," Abram said, his voice a little softer this time. "Time to go." For a long, breathless moment the boy remained frozen. Then, slowly, as if his feet were made of lead, he stepped off the auction block. The crowd watched in silence as this strange pair, the broken man and the boy with his silent burden, came together. Abram turned and started walking away, not looking back to see if Caleb was following. He didn't have to. He could hear the soft, shuffling sound of bare feet on dusty ground right behind him. The ride back to the ranch was long and silent. The miles stretched out between them, filled with unspoken questions. Abram didn't push, Caleb didn't offer anything, and the baby, Matthew, wrapped in his bundle, still hadn't made a single sound. It was unnerving. Abram had been around newborns. They cried, they fussed, they screamed. This one was as quiet as a stone. When they finally reached the wooden gate of the ranch, Caleb's eyes flicked up for the first time. He read the words carved into the arch above them. Cutter Homestead. But beneath it, another word was carved, so faded by sun and time it was almost invisible. Hope. Abram saw him looking. My wife Abigail named it that. Said every home needed it. Caleb didn't respond. He just stared at the faded word as they passed under it. The house was simple and sturdy, clean but empty. Far too many rooms for one man. Abram pushed open a door at the end of the hall. The air inside was still and smelled of dust and old memories. This room was hers, Abram said, his voice thick. I clean it once a week. Haven't used it since she passed. In the corner stood a crib. A small, beautifully carved wooden crib with a blanket folded neatly inside. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light cutting through the shutters. Without a word, Caleb walked past Abram, crossed the room, and with a gentleness that made Abram's throat tighten, he laid the silent baby down in the crib. The baby stirred, its tiny lips parting, but still no cry came. What's his name? Abram asked, breaking the silence. Matthew, Caleb whispered, his voice so quiet it was barely there. And you're Caleb. It wasn't a question. Abram left him there and went to the kitchen. He made biscuits and beans, and they ate in that same heavy silence. Later that night, Abram sat on the porch, his pipe cold in his hand, watching the moon rise over the hills. The quiet of the ranch felt different tonight, not just empty, but waiting. He heard soft footsteps from inside, Caleb, pacing back and forth, from his room to the nursery, checking on Matthew again and again. An hour passed before the front door creaked open and the boy stepped out onto the porch. Is it always this quiet out here? Caleb asked, staring out into the darkness. Most nights, Abram answered. Caleb nodded. I don't like the quiet. A confession. The first crack in his armor. Me neither, Abram admitted, but you get used to it. They sat there for a long time, two strangers bound by a $5 sale, listening to the coyotes howl in the distance. Then, out of nowhere, Caleb spoke again, his voice flat and dead. He hasn't cried, not since Ma died. Abram turned to look at him. She was holding him, Caleb continued, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The house caught fire. She handed him to me through the window just before the roof came down. He paused, his small hands clenching into fists. Her hair was on fire, but she didn't scream. Abram's heart felt like a cold stone in his chest. He said nothing. He just listened. They said it was lightning that started it. Caleb's voice was now a venomous hiss. But they lied. I saw the man. I saw him throw the torch. A chill that had nothing to do with the night air crawled up Abram's spine. He didn't have to ask who. In a territory this rough, monsters didn't always hide in the dark. Sometimes they walked in plain daylight. But the real shock came just before dawn, a cry. Loud, sudden, and piercing. It ripped through the silent house, and Abram was on his feet in a second. He burst into the nursery to find Caleb already there, leaning over the crib. But this wasn't a cry of pain. It was a hungry cry, a needy cry, a real, living cry. Matthew was finally awake. Abram brought a bottle of warm milk and the baby drank greedily, his tiny hands clutching at Caleb's fingers. And for the first time, Abram saw something flicker in Caleb's eyes. It wasn't hope, not yet, but it was the memory of what hope felt like. Later that afternoon, while he was mending a fence on the west pasture, Abram saw them. Boot prints. They weren't his. They weren't Caleb's. They were fresh. Too fresh. Someone had been on his land, watching the house. He didn't say anything to Caleb. Not yet. But that night, for the first time in 5 years, Abram Cutter bolted the door, oiled his rifle, and laid a hatchet by his bed. Trouble hadn't just followed the boys to his ranch. It had been waiting for them. And it was getting closer. The trip to Clearwater for supplies was tense. Abram could feel eyes on them the whole way. Caleb insisted on carrying Matthew in a sling Abram had fashioned from an old feed sack, keeping the baby pressed tight against his chest, as if he expected someone to snatch him away at any moment. The whispers started the second they stepped into the general store. That's the boy from the auction. Why's he still got that baby? What's a man like Cutter want with orphans? Abram tried to ignore them, his face a mask of stone, but he could see Caleb's jaw clenching, his small spine straightening with defiance. He was a boy trying to wear the armor of a man. Then a drunkard stumbled out of the saloon and blocked their path. He reeked of cheap whiskey and malice. Best give that squalor to someone who can raise him proper, Cutter, he slurred, pointing a grimy finger at Matthew. Before Abram could even move, Caleb stepped forward, positioning himself between the drunk and his brother. He looked the man dead in the eye, his own gaze burning with a fire that was terrifying in a child. He's mine, Caleb said, his voice low and shaking with a fury that made the drunk take a step back. The man blinked, surprised by the venom, and then shuffled away, muttering to himself. Abram didn't have to say a word. He just placed a heavy hand on Caleb's shoulder, a silent message of approval passing between them. On the ride back to the ranch, Abram felt the fragile thread connecting them pull a little tighter. They rode in their usual silence, but it felt different now. Less like the silence of strangers, and more like the quiet of men who understood each other without needing words. That evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, they sat on the porch. Matthew was asleep in the crib just inside the open door. Out of the blue, Caleb asked a question that caught Abram completely off guard. Did you want kids? Abram hesitated, the question hitting a nerve he thought had long gone dead. He stared out at the land he'd worked alone for so long. I had names picked out, he admitted, his voice rough with emotion. Before the doctor told Abigail and me, that it wasn't going to happen. What names? Caleb asked, his voice barely a whisper. Abram let out a dry, humorless chuckle. Jacob and Ruth. Caleb looked down at the floorboards, then back up at Abram, his young face uncharacteristically serious. There was a long pause, and Abram thought the conversation was over. But then Caleb spoke again, his voice soft but clear, the words hanging in the still evening air. Can I call you something? Abram blinked, confused. What? Caleb shifted, gathering his courage. Papa. The word hit Abram like a physical blow. Papa, a name he'd never dreamed he'd hear, a name that Abigail had whispered to him in the dark, a lifetime ago. He couldn't speak. His throat was too thick, his heart too full. He just looked at the boy, his boy, and gave a slow, deliberate nod. For the first time in 5 long, empty years, the silence of the Cutter Ranch didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a beginning. But as he sat there, a new, cold dread began to creep into Abram's heart. The man Caleb saw at the fire, the boot prints on his land, the whispers in town. It was all connected. This wasn't just a random act of violence. This was a hunt. And the prey had just been delivered to his doorstep. That night, Abram didn't sleep. He sat in the dark, listening. He heard Caleb get up twice to check on Matthew. He heard the wind whispering through the eaves. And then he heard something else. A horse. It was moving slowly, cautiously, up the trail toward the ranch. It stopped just shy of the main gate, a shadow in the moonlight. Abram grabbed his rifle, his knuckles white. He peered through the window and saw a figure on horseback, watching the house. Just watching. The figure sat there for what felt like an eternity, a silent, menacing sentinel. Then, as slowly as it arrived, it turned and rode back into the darkness. Abram knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that this was just a scout. This was a promise. The man who burned Caleb's mother to death wasn't gone. He was close, and he knew where the boys were. The next morning, Abram tried to act normal, but the tension was a living thing in the small cabin. While they were gathering eggs from the chicken coop, Caleb finally broke the silence. I saw him last night, he said, his voice quiet. He didn't look at Abram. Abram didn't pretend to be confused. The man from the fire? Caleb nodded, his small hands trembling as he placed an egg in the basket. His name is Eldon Rake. The name landed like a punch to Abram's gut. He knew that name, Eldon Rake, a vicious thug who'd worked the lumber lines a decade ago. He'd been run out of the territory for nearly beating a man to death over a card game. He'd drifted north, and the rumors that followed were ugly. They said he'd come back with money and a badge some said he'd bought, not earned. He called himself a land overseer now, but everyone knew what that meant. He was a vulture, preying on the weak, chasing settlers off their claims and buying up the land for pennies on the dollar. Why? Abram asked, his voice low and dangerous. Why would he do it? Ma, she helped people, Caleb said, his voice cracking. She taught kids to read, patched up folks who got hurt, gave bread to families who had none. He looked up at Abram, his eyes burning. He said she was stirring up trouble. He came to the house one night, drunk and yelling. He told her he'd show her what happens to people who don't know their place. The next morning, she was dead. Did you tell the sheriff? Abram asked, his grip tightening on the handle of his axe. He said there was no proof, Caleb spat, the words bitter in his mouth. No witnesses, no confession, just the word of a boy. He looked away, his shoulders slumping. No justice. Abram felt a familiar hot anger rise in his chest. He'd seen this before, the law looking the other way while men like Rake carved up the world for themselves. He's not going to stop, Caleb whispered. He's going to come back for us. Abram knelt down and looked the boy square in the eye. Then we'll be ready for him. But Abram was hiding a secret that made Eldon Rake more than just a memory. Before Abram was a rancher, before he was a husband, he was a lawman, a U.S. Marshal. And he hadn't just retired. He'd been forced out. It was 10 years ago. He'd been tracking a ring of land grabbers, men who were using fraudulent deeds and violence to steal property from new settlers. The operation was slick, protected from the top down. Every time Abram got close, his witnesses would disappear, or evidence would be lost. The man pulling the strings was smart, ruthless, and invisible. The only name that kept popping up on the fringes was a hired thug, a brute named Eldon Rake. Abram had been building a case against the whole operation, a case that led all the way to a powerful territorial judge. The night before he was going to make his arrests, his office was burned to the ground. All his evidence, all his work, gone up in smoke. The next day, he was stripped of his badge. They called it negligence. He knew it was a message. He'd buried that part of his life along with his wife, but now it had come roaring back. Rake wasn't just after Caleb. This fire, this orphanage, it was the same pattern, the same evil. That night, after Caleb was asleep, Abram pried up a loose floorboard under his bed. He pulled out a dusty, oilcloth-wrapped bundle. Inside was his old Colt revolver and a tarnished silver star, a U.S. Marshal's badge. He stared at it, the weight of his past heavy in his hand. He wasn't just protecting two boys. He was stepping back into a war he thought he'd lost. The next days were a quiet storm of preparation. Abram didn't teach Caleb how to be scared. He taught him how to be ready. He showed him how to oil the door hinges so they opened without a sound, how to spot fresh tracks in the dust, how to hold a knife, not for fighting, but for survival. He was turning the boy into a soldier, and he hated himself for it. A few days later, a note appeared, pinned to the barn door with a hunting knife. The handwriting was a crude, angry scrawl. "Give back what ain't yours, Cutter, or watch it all burn again." Caleb found Abram reading it, his face pale. "What does it mean?" "It means trouble's here," Abram said, ripping the note from the door. He burned it in the stove that night, but the words hung in the air like smoke. He knew he couldn't face this alone. Rake wouldn't come by himself. He'd bring a crew. So Abram sent a message with a passing trader, a coded letter to a man named Warren Tate in Sable Junction. Warren was another ex-lawman, one of the few men Abram still trusted, a man who'd also been pushed out by the same corrupt system. The message was simple. "The wolves are at the door. I could use a second gun." While they waited, a strange kind of peace settled over the ranch. It was the calm before the storm, and every moment felt precious. Matthew learned to crawl, his tiny hands patting the wooden floor as he explored his new world. Caleb even laughed, a real, genuine laugh, when one of the goats playfully headbutted him off his feet. One evening, as a thunderstorm rolled in from the east, they sat on the porch, watching the lightning flash across the sky. "What if I'm not good at this?" Abram asked, the words torn from a place of deep fear. "At what?" Caleb asked. "Being a father?" Caleb was quiet for a long time, listening to the thunder rumble. Then he said, so softly Abram almost missed it, "My ma used to say you don't have to be good at loving. You just have to choose to keep doing it, especially when it's hard." Abram stared out into the stormy darkness. He had made his choice. These boys were his now, and anyone who tried to take them would have to go through him. But as the storm raged, a new, terrifying thought struck him. Rake didn't just burn the orphanage to kill Caleb's mother. An orphanage is a public place, full of records, birth certificates, adoption papers, family histories. What if Rake wasn't just trying to silence a witness? What if he was trying to destroy a piece of paper? What if Caleb and Matthew weren't who they seemed to be? The quiet baby, the boy who carried him from the flames, the obsessive hunt by a powerful man. It wasn't just about revenge, it was about an inheritance, and Abram was standing right in the middle of it. The rider came at dawn, a phantom galloping through the morning mist. He rode his horse hard, not sparing it, and Abram had his rifle up before the man even cleared the ridge. But then the rider raised a hand, not in threat, but in greeting. It was Warren Tate. He practically fell out of the saddle, his horse heaving, its coat slick with sweat and foam. "You look like you've been chased by the devil himself," Abram grunted, grabbing the reins. Warren didn't smile. "Might as well have been," he rasped, stumbling toward the house. Inside, Caleb stood by the fire, holding Matthew, his small body tense. He was a sentinel guarding his post. Abram gave him a reassuring nod. "This is Warren. He's a friend." Caleb didn't relax, but he acknowledged the man with a slight dip of his chin. Warren collapsed into a chair, shaking rain and exhaustion from his coat. "I rode all night," he said, his voice ragged. "Came from Jasper Ridge, saw smoke from the Butte Trail, a homestead, burned to cinders." He looked up, his eyes grim. "It wasn't a raid. It was methodical, deliberate. I found a survivor, an old man hiding in a creek bed. He said the men who did it, they wore badges." Abram's blood ran cold. "Rake," Warren nodded. "He's got at least 6 men with him, telling folks he's collecting on property debts for the county. But these people didn't owe a dime. They just happened to be living on land that someone powerful wants." "And the law?" Abram asked, though he already knew the answer. Warren spat on the floor. "Bought or blind, same as it ever was." He looked at Abram, his expression hard. "They're coming for you, Abe. They're riding slow, sweeping the valley. They're not just after the boy. They're erasing everyone who won't bend the knee." He leaned forward. "The old man I found. He said Rake was asking questions, not just about Caleb, but about his mother, about where she came from, who her people were." The pieces were clicking into place, forming a picture that was darker than Abram had imagined. This wasn't just about a plot of land, it was about bloodlines. "How long do we have?" Abram asked. "A day, maybe less." The rest of the day was a blur of frantic preparation. They barricaded the windows, reinforced the doors, and loaded every weapon they had. Caleb worked like a man possessed, his small face a mask of grim determination. He boiled water, packed bags with food, and sharpened every tool that could be used as a weapon. He was getting ready for a war he shouldn't have had to fight. That evening, Abram and Warren stood in the barn, the lantern light casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. The air was thick with the smell of oil and steel. "You know they won't fight fair," Warren said, his voice low. "They never do," Abram replied, his hands moving with practiced ease as he cleaned his revolver. "The kid's tough," Warren observed, nodding toward the house. "He's more than tough," Abram said. He paused, then added quietly, "He's everything I thought I'd lost." He looked up, his eyes meeting Warren's in the dim light. "I buried Abigail on that hill, Warren. I buried my future with her. I was just waiting to die. Then this boy walks into my life and hands me a reason to live again." Warren was silent for a moment. "A reason worth dying for?" It's the only thing that is, Abram said, his voice hard as iron. Just then, Caleb appeared in the doorway of the barn, his silhouette framed by the light from the house. He was holding something, an old, worn Bible. "Papa," he said, his voice small but steady, "I think you should see this." He opened the Bible to the inside cover. On the page dedicated to family history, written in his mother's elegant script, were the names. Mother, Annalise Dubois. Father, Henri Dubois. And below that, a single line. Property, the Dubois claim, 500 acres, Silver Creek. Abram's breath caught in his throat. The Dubois claim. It wasn't just a myth. It was one of the richest silver strikes in the territory, a claim that had been lost for 50 years. The family had supposedly died out, the land reverting to the territory. But it hadn't. It had passed to Annalise, to Caleb's mother, and now it belonged to him. This wasn't about revenge. This was about a fortune. Rake wasn't trying to kill a boy. He was trying to eliminate the rightful heir to the richest piece of land in the county. The orphanage fire wasn't just murder. It was an attempt to destroy the last record of Caleb's lineage. But they'd failed. The proof was right here, in this Bible. Suddenly, a new horrifying realization dawned on Abram. He looked from Caleb to the Bible, and then his eyes widened in terror. "Where's Matthew?" he asked, his voice tight with panic. Caleb's face went pale. "Inside, asleep in the crib." A cold dread seized Abram. The silent baby, the baby who came from the fire. Caleb had called him his brother, but they looked nothing alike. Rake's obsession. It wasn't just Caleb. "Caleb," Abram said, his voice shaking. "Was Matthew born before the fire?" Caleb shook his head. "No. Ma found him, a few days before, on the road. His mother, she was sick. She died right after she handed him to Ma. She made Ma promise to take care of him." Abram grabbed the lantern and rushed back to the house, his heart pounding. He went to the nursery and gently pulled back the baby's blanket. There, on a thin silver chain around Matthew's neck, was a tiny locket. Abram's hands trembled as he opened it. Inside wasn't a picture. It was a tiny, intricately engraved crest. A crest he recognized. It was the seal of Territorial Judge Martin Langley, the most powerful man in the county, the man who had stripped Abram of his badge. Matthew wasn't an orphan. He was the judge's illegitimate son, a secret the judge would kill to protect. Rake wasn't just working for the judge. He was cleaning up his mess. He was hunting Caleb, the heir to the Dubois silver claim, and Matthew, the heir to the judge's secret shame. They hadn't just inherited land and secrets. They had inherited a death sentence from the most powerful man in the territory. And the executioners were riding down the trail right now. The hoofbeats stopped just outside the gate. A voice, slick with false authority, cut through the tense silence. "Cutter, this is Eldon Rake, acting on behalf of the county. We have a warrant. Step outside. Let's talk like men." Abram took a deep breath. He handed the Bible to Caleb. "Take this in, Matthew. Go to the root cellar. Bar the door. Do not come out no matter what you hear. Do you understand me?" Caleb's eyes were wide with terror, but he nodded, clutching the book to his chest. "I won't leave you." "You will," Abram said, his voice a low command. "Because that's what fathers ask their sons to do. Now go." He watched Caleb disappear into the cellar, then turned to Warren. "Let's give them hell." Abram stepped out onto the porch, his rifle held loosely at his side. He saw Rake immediately. He was bigger than Abram remembered, more bloated with power and cruelty. The badge on his chest shone like a brass lie. 6 men flanked him, their faces hard and empty, hired guns. "I see you picked up some strays, Cutter," Rake sneered. "And I see you're still collecting trash," Abram shot back. Rake's face darkened. "I'm here for the boys. They're evidence in a legal matter. Hand them over." "They're not evidence. They're my sons." Rake laughed, a nasty grating sound. "You always were soft, Cutter. Always picking honor over survival. Look where it got you." "Still breathing," Abram said softly. "Still free." "Not for long," Rake snarled, and he reached for his gun. But he never cleared the holster. A gunshot cracked the morning air. It came from the attic window. One of Rake's men crumpled to the ground, a neat hole in his shoulder. Warren had fired the first shot. All hell broke loose. Abram dove from the porch, firing his shotgun into the dirt in front of the men, scattering them. Rake's men returned fire, bullets splintering the wood of the cabin. Abram rolled behind a water trough, reloading as splinters rained down around him. Warren fired again from the attic, his shots methodical and deadly, pinning the attackers down. One of Rake's men screamed as a bullet tore through his leg. Another crawled for cover, only to be met by Abram's second shotgun blast. Rake, enraged, charged forward, firing wildly at the house. Abram rose from behind the trough and met him in the middle of the yard. It wasn't a gunfight anymore. It was a brawl. They crashed into the mud, fists flying. It was ugly, desperate, and brutal. Abram took a blow to the jaw that sent stars exploding behind his eyes. He answered with a knee to Rake's ribs, rewarded with a grunt of pain. Finally, Abram got the upper hand. He pinned Rake to the ground, the barrel of his rifle pressed against the man's temple. Rake laughed, blood and mud smearing his face. "You can kill me, Cutter," he gasped. "But you can't kill the judge. He'll send more men. He'll never stop." "Let him," Abram snarled, and he brought the butt of the rifle down hard. The world went silent. The smoke cleared, leaving the smell of gunpowder hanging heavy in the air. Warren limped down from the attic, a grim smile on his face. "Guess we ain't too old after all," he muttered. Abram stood over Rake's unconscious form, his chest heaving. He'd won the battle, but Rake's words echoed in his mind. "You can't kill the judge." Suddenly a cry came from the cellar, a cry of pure terror. Abram's blood ran cold. He ripped the cellar door open to find Caleb standing there, his face ashen. He wasn't looking at Abram. He was looking past him, at the tree line. "They took him," Caleb whispered, his voice broken. "They took Matthew." Abram spun around. At the edge of the woods, a lone rider was disappearing into the trees. In his arms was a small, bundled shape. It hadn't been a frontal assault. It had been a diversion. While Rake and his men attacked from the front, another man had slipped in from the back. Abram had been so focused on the monster in front of him that he hadn't seen the real devil sneak past. He hadn't just lost the war, he'd lost his son. The world tilted. For a moment, Abram couldn't breathe. The victory over Rake turned to ash in his mouth. He'd been a fool. He'd underestimated them. He'd played right into their hands. "How?" he choked out, grabbing Caleb by the shoulders. "The door was barred." Caleb was shaking uncontrollably. "There's another way out, an old storm drain. It opens into the creek bed. I didn't know." His face crumpled, tears finally breaking through his stoic facade. "It's my fault. I was supposed to protect him." "No," Abram said, his voice a raw growl. "This is not on you." He stood up, his gaze turning toward the woods where the rider had vanished. A fire he hadn't felt in a decade ignited in his soul. It was the cold, righteous fury of a U.S. Marshal. Warren came running, his face grim. "Abe, Rake's men are dead or scattered. We got him tied up in the barn." "Forget him," Abram snarled. "They have Matthew. They're taking him to the judge." "We'll never catch them," Warren said, his voice heavy with defeat. "They have too much of a head start. By the time we get to the Capitol, it'll be too late. The judge will have him hidden away, and we'll be shot on sight for what we did here today." Abram wasn't listening. His mind was racing, piecing together fragments of old memories, old maps, old cases. Judge Langley. He was predictable. He wouldn't take the main roads. He wouldn't risk being seen with the child. He would use the old forgotten trails. There was a place, an old abandoned relay station he used as a private meeting spot, a place no one was supposed to know about. But Abram knew. "Get the horses," Abram commanded. "Pack light, ammunition, and water. Nothing else." "Abe, it's suicide," Warren argued. "They took my son," Abram said, his eyes burning with a terrifying light. "Suicide is a luxury I can't afford." He turned to Caleb. The boy had stopped crying. His face was a pale, determined mask. He held the old Bible in one hand and a small, sharpened hatchet in the other. "I'm coming with you," Caleb said. It wasn't a request. Abram looked at the boy. He saw the fire in his eyes, the same fire that had kept him alive in the ashes of his old life. He saw a warrior. He nodded once. "Stay close." They rode like madmen, pushing their horses to the brink of collapse. They didn't follow the trail. They cut across the harsh, unforgiving land, guided by Abram's memory. Hours bled into one another. The sun beat down on them, but they didn't stop. As they crested a rocky bluff, Abram pulled his horse to a halt. Below them, in a small, hidden valley, was the abandoned relay station. 2 horses were tied outside. "They're here," Abram whispered. They dismounted, moving with the stealth of ghosts. Abram motioned for Warren to circle around to the back. He and Caleb would go in the front. "Caleb," Abram said, his voice low. "Inside is a man who is the law, but he is not a man of justice. He is a man of secrets and sin. Do not hesitate." Caleb nodded, his knuckles white around the handle of his hatchet. Abram kicked the door in. The room was dim, smelling of dust and decay. Judge Langley stood by a small, grimy window, his back to them. He was a tall, imposing man, dressed in a fine suit that was laughably out of place in the derelict cabin. In a makeshift crib in the corner, Matthew was crying, a real, terrified cry. The judge turned, his face a mask of cold fury. He wasn't surprised. He was angry that his sanctuary had been breached. Next to him stood the man who had taken Matthew, a hired gun with dead eyes. "Cutter," the judge said, his voice smooth as poisoned honey. "You've made a grave error. You should have stayed buried." "Give me the boy, Langley," Abram growled. The judge actually smiled. "This child is a stain, a mistake I am in the process of rectifying. As for the other one," he glanced at Caleb, "the heir to the Dubois fortune, a loose end. You've conveniently brought them both to me. It saves me the trouble of hunting you down." He nodded to his gunman. "Kill them. Burn the cabin. Leave nothing." The gunman raised his pistol, but he never fired. An arrow sprouted from his chest. He looked down, surprised, then collapsed. Warren stood in the back doorway, another arrow already knocked. The judge didn't flinch. With surprising speed, he lunged for the crib, pulling Matthew out and holding the crying baby in front of him like a shield. "You won't shoot a man holding a child, will you, Marshal?" he sneered, using Abram's old title like a weapon. "You still have a code, don't you?" Abram's rifle was up, but he couldn't get a clear shot. He was frozen. But Caleb wasn't. With a scream of pure rage, Caleb charged. He didn't go for the judge. He ran toward the fireplace and grabbed the hot iron poker from the dying embers. He spun, the glowing tip of the poker arcing through the dim light, and slammed it against the judge's gun hand. Langley screamed in agony, dropping his pistol as the smell of seared flesh filled the room. He shoved Matthew away, the baby tumbling onto a pile of rags, and staggered back, clutching his burned hand. Abram didn't wait. He lunged forward, not with his gun, but with his fists. He tackled the judge, sending them both crashing through a rotten wall and out into the dirt. The fight was short and brutal. Abram, fueled by a father's rage, was a force of nature. He subdued the judge, binding his hands with a piece of rope from his saddle. Inside, Caleb had already scooped Matthew into his arms, whispering soothing words, rocking him gently. The baby's cries subsided into small, hiccuping sobs. Warren looked from the bound and defeated judge to the 2 boys. "What do we do now, Abe? We can't just kill him." "No," Abram said, his chest heaving. "We're not going to kill him." He walked over to Caleb and took the Bible from the boy's saddlebag. "We're going to do something worse." He opened the book to the page with Caleb's family history. Then he looked Judge Langley dead in the eye. "We're going to tell the truth." They rode back not to the ranch, but straight to the territorial capital. They didn't sneak in. They rode right down the middle of the main street, a strange and fearsome procession. Abram in the lead, rifle across his lap. Warren beside him, his face like stone. Caleb followed, holding Matthew, his expression one of fierce pride. And trailing behind them, tied to Abram's saddle horn, was the humbled, disheveled form of Judge Martin Langley. People poured out of shops and saloons to stare, their mouths agape. They saw their powerful, untouchable judge being led like a common criminal. They marched straight to the steps of the federal courthouse. Abram dismounted and dragged Langley up the steps. He held up the old Bible for all to see. "This man," Abram's voice boomed across the stunned crowd, "is a thief and a murderer. He tried to steal the birthright of this boy, Caleb Dubois." He pointed to Caleb, who stood tall, a silent testament to the truth. "And he tried to murder his own son, this innocent baby, to protect his good name." Langley's face was purple with rage. "Lies! This man is a disgraced ex-marshal. He's a kidnapper." "Is he?" Abram shot back. He ripped the locket from around Matthew's neck and threw it at the feet of the ranking federal marshal who had come out to see what the commotion was about. "Open it. You'll recognize the seal." The marshal, a man named Peters who remembered Abram, hesitantly picked up the locket. His eyes widened as he saw the judge's personal crest. Whispers turned into a roar. "And this," Abram said, his voice dropping, "is Eldon Rake, Judge Langley's personal executioner." Warren appeared, dragging the bound and gagged Rake from a pack horse. He threw him on the steps next to the judge. "He confessed," Warren said simply. "Confessed to the fires, the murders, all of it. All on the judge's orders." It was over. The judge's empire of fear and corruption crumbled in the space of 10 minutes, right there on the courthouse steps. The truth, once unleashed, was more powerful than any army of hired guns. In the weeks that followed, the territory was turned upside down. Judge Langley and Eldon Rake were tried and convicted. The fraudulent land deeds were exposed, and property was returned to its rightful owners. The Dubois claim was officially recognized and put into a trust for Caleb, managed by Abram. One crisp autumn afternoon, Abram stood with Caleb and Matthew on the hill overlooking the ranch. The land was theirs now, safe. He had a new badge in his pocket, a silver star pinned there by a grateful territorial governor who had asked him to help rebuild the law in the valley. He was a marshal again. But that's not what mattered. He watched Caleb showing Matthew a wildflower, his voice patient and kind. He saw the way the baby looked at his older brother with pure adoration. He saw the faded word carved into the gate below them: hope. Abigail had been right. Every home needed it. He'd just forgotten how to find it. Caleb looked up at him, a real smile lighting up his face. Not the sad, haunted smile of a boy who had survived, but the bright, open smile of a boy who was home. "Papa," he said, "it's getting late. We should go inside." Abram put his arms around his two sons, pulling them close. The gaping wound in his heart, the one he thought would never heal, felt full. He looked out at the vast, beautiful land that was their future. He was Abram Cutter. He was a marshal. He was a rancher. But most importantly, he was a father, and he was finally home. This story is a testament to the fact that family isn't about the blood you share, but about the people you'd bleed for. It's a reminder that even in the darkest of times, one person choosing to do the right thing can change the world. If you were moved by Abram and his boys, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, because we have so many more incredible stories of courage and hope coming your way.